This talk is going to pick up on some of the concepts and discussions already having taken place, including at this panel. In particular, I'd like to start with certain assumptions, one being that the relation between the universal and the particular is one of contamination right from the start. So I will not analyze what other people have already shown really well, including at this panel, which is that universalist pretensions always harbor some kind of local provenance. I take that for granted and would argue that it is in the gap or in the relation between different forms of universal and particular relationships that political subjectivation takes place. So every time the universal gets filled in by a particular determination, which is what we call universalism, that's when political subjectivation is possible. To concretize this, I'll look at one case around asylum in the Netherlands and have two focuses here, or two foci here. One is the relation between the state and civil society. So how do we rethink universalism by looking at the shifting relationship between state and civil society? And this will link up to earlier discussions about what is the state and what is civil society, and the need to maybe question some kind of permanent division between the two. The asylum case brings up some important questions about where we draw the boundary between them. So that's the first, that's more of a conceptual question. Where do you draw the boundary? The more empirical question emerges out of the case itself, where I want to look at what is the discourse that is used in order to make a political subject. And here the discourse that emerges is that of, explicitly that of culture, and by implication, the space from which this discourse of culture emerges is community. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by community in a second. So, universal in particular, state and civil society, and the discourse of culture. The recent Brighton conference on the European Court of Human Rights was a good example of the ways in which the universal gets negotiated. On the one hand, there were proposals to limit access of citizens to the court, while on the other hand, there were proposals to increase the speed for processing specific cases. So in this case, human rights as a kind of universal concept clearly emerged as a site of contestation at the recent conference. This is just one example of where, if the universal is up for grabs, it'll be good to look at what the spatial contours of this contestation around universality are. I'd like to argue here that the politics of asylum is one particular location, if you will, where one can test these universalist assumptions, because they're instituted in different kinds of declarations and laws. And what emerges here is a discourse of culture and community which doesn't oppose universalism, but precisely fills in a universalist discourse with a local determination. So the universalist discourse of human rights gets a specific substantialization, as it were. And this is what I'll look at, particularly in the context of the nation state, which of course is part of a broader set of political entities, so that appeals for the protection of asylum seekers in the Dutch case refers to rights of asylum seekers, which has been instituted beyond the Dutch state, of course. This spatial disorientation of universalism then emerges through reorienting the meanings of community, citizenship, and culture. In particular, what interests me is the way in which citizens who have struggled to protect the rights of those who do not have those rights, right? So in this case, it is citizens aligning themselves with non-citizens, asylum seekers, and producing a certain kind of equalization. What they do is they enter onto the stage of a fight between the immigration service, for example, and the asylum seeker, and the way in which citizens got involved in this dispute became a kind of third actor on the stage, as it were. And what interests me is the ambivalent conclusions one can draw from this entry of the third actor, which is the discourse of culture and community. Is it? I'm okay? Yeah? Okay. Here I'd like to simply point out one conceptual way I'd like to talk about equalization. When I said that the citizen equalizes with the non-citizen, I'm not assuming that these identities are the same. Rather, I'm saying that equalization happens at the end of this process. It's not like there are two identities which are identical and then align, but rather they're equalized at the end of the process of political struggle. And here I borrow the notion of equality from Jacques Rancière's work on politics, where he argues that it is paradoxically through the use of difference that we strengthen equality rather than alterity. The argument there being what is political is precisely equalization of identities that are not identical. And therefore one undertakes a politics of equality rather than alterity, which I think is important given a kind of resurgence of cultural identity as specificity, as if cultural specificity somehow guarantees democratization. Like, for example, Martin Jack's argument yesterday that true democracy is when you have the resurgence of Western culture, non-Western cultural identities. For me, that would not be an example of democracy. That would be an example of the resurgence of alterity rather than the deepening of democracy. So Rancière's notion of equality argues that political dissensus is staged precisely when those not counted within the sphere of equality articulate their presence on a common stage. That is, the excluded do not make claims to difference and expose the limited character of universality. Rather, the excluded insist on their inclusion within universalism, and by doing so, they reorient or disorient the spatial parameters of what counts as universalism. This kind of equalization interrupts what I mean by changing the spatial parameters, and here we return to the state, has to do with previous discussions we had yesterday and today. I think in Bela Bhatia's article, we saw an example of this kind of strange thing where the state aligns itself with an illegal organization, a Sena, private army. So you have, which becomes a kind of organ of the state, as it were, and then the citizen becomes outside the purview of the state, is termed illegal, a terrorist, right? So it's very hard to then, in these kind of situations, say, where does the state stop and where does the non-state sphere begin? The state is always interfering and expanding these sorts of alliances. In the example that I will give, the asylum case, it's the other way around. It is alliances set up outside the sphere of the state, which then impinge on the state's own logic. Historically, there's of course a precedence to this, the relationship of the state to civil society. I'll just mention it very briefly as a reminder, which is Marx's essay on the Jewish question, where he critiques Bruno Bauer, saying the issue is not really about religion or about the Jewish question, but very quickly, as you might remember, Marx launches into a critique of the state. He says it's the pretensions of the state's own neutrality and universalism that needs to be critiqued, rather than putting the onus on citizens to give up their cultural or other forms of belonging. The conceptual point there is that the state does not exist except as a kind of relational entity. He says, universal emancipation, therefore, implies spanning a divide between these two. Bauer demands that Jews should liberate themselves from religion in political life, yet for Marx, emancipation from religion, and indeed from any other forms of belonging, assumes that the state embodies universal emancipation itself. And he plays with this pun. He says the state can be a free state without man being a free man. And that's the crux of his critique. And the free state is a Freistaat, which means also it's a pun on a democracy, right? That's what one would call a democracy. So democracy could be defined as precisely where man is unfree. So keeping that in mind, that instead of putting the onus on citizens and those in civil society to prove their allegiance to a state that embodies universalism, one could question the claims of universalism of the state itself. That question has, not recently, some 20 years ago or so, been argued in relation to Laclau's work on the relationship between the universal and the particular. I'll simply remind us of a couple of points. One is any claim to cultural identity or alterity assumes a universalist frame. So the distinction universal and particular doesn't really hold. The political question becomes, how do we fill in that universal and what kinds of discourses do we use? So here I'll turn to the specific example in Holland. Samaro, an asylum seeker, arrived at the age of 9 from Angola to the Netherlands without a family. He was taken in by a family and grew up for the next 9 years in the south of Holland in a province called Limburg, which is at the border with Belgium. And when he reached the age of 18, his appeal for asylum was turned down, so he was scheduled for deportation. And when this happened, there was grassroots activism from the neighborhood, from the school, from his classmates, from his Dutch family, and the village of Limburg itself. What interested me here was this really powerful and visible mobilization of support for Mauro, who was framed as the soft-spoken model young man. 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. A fanatic footballer, a good student, etc. He wrote a letter to the immigration minister, which now we know he didn't write himself. So what is my question, but anyway, someone else did, where he describes his problems if he was sent back after waiting 8 years. What is striking about that letter is the ways in which he framed himself. And I'd just like to, it's all in Dutch, but okay. He has adjusted to Dutch culture, he says, to the Minister of Immigration. He is completely proficient in the language, in Dutch, so language proficiency. Not only that, I have a very strong Limburg's accent, which I'll never lose, he says, which is kind of, you know, you really prove your belonging by having a local accent, right? So, and the Limburg accent has kind of, let's just say, some kind of symbolic significance in the Dutch context. He expresses physical fear of never being able to adjust to Angola and having to give up his life in Holland and his family, whom he sees as his real family. Lears responded in a controversial interview by saying, we need to look at individual cases and we can't make exceptions, quote, however pleasing a young man is or physically attractive a girl is. Look at the distinction, right? This got even worse when later on a young Somalian woman was scheduled for deportation, but the Council of State, the Raad van State, which has an advisory role in the Dutch context, intervened and said she can't be sent back because she has been, quote, sufficiently westernized, unquote. And therefore she would not fit in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab, of course, at that time was supposedly in power, right? So the argument here is that a kind of amorphous discourse of sports, study, community, family belonging, all of which seem completely legitimate as an example of the difficulty this person would have to move. And then in the case of the Somalian woman, the fact that she was sufficiently westernized were the reasons for which they were not deported. So here culture the whole discourse of culture and community on the one hand has two aspects to it. It made the border between state and civil society quite vague or fuzzy, because mayors of towns and cities in Holland now agitate against the government and against the immigration service. The local community, the schools, the churches, they get involved in this debate. So there's a spatial disturbance, if you will, and here one could think of Gramsci's notion of not the state, but the state-tolerary logic, he calls it, that there is no, sometimes it's difficult in the case of these controversies to identify where the state ends and civil society begins, because local government seems to side with asylum seekers against the national government. The state did respond though, and its response was very telling. Its response was a discourse of westernization. In other words, one would ask, so if an asylum seeker, a woman who wears a headscarf, what happens? Is she insufficiently westernized and therefore to be sent out? And so here's the ambivalence, that spatially there's a disturbance of the logic between what is state and civil society, but at the level of culture, 2 minutes? At the level of culture, there is this ambivalent discourse. It's successful. It's very successful in the case of these individual cases, and therefore it shows how an equalization of citizen with non-citizen works, when citizens get involved in protecting the rights of non-citizens. But the discourse that is deployed there is disturbing. What's interesting for me in the Dutch context is we've had this discourse before, and it came from a much more politically elite figure, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you might have heard of, the partner of Neil Ferguson, so they match each other perfectly. But now this discourse is politically interesting to me because it emerges, if you will, from the grassroots and puts pressure on the state. But the language in which it does so, of course, causes, rightly I think, pause for some concern. And keeping that in mind, I would like to say simply that if universalism simply means a particular kind of specific discourse that fills the empty place of the universal, one could keep questioning in what way does the universal get restaged. That seems to me to be the political question now. What discourses are used in order to make appeal to the rights which the state is supposed to protect? In this case, quite clearly, there seems to be some kind of universal discourse which is thoroughly national, right? Accent, language proficiency, diet, etc. I can't help mentioning this thing up there, Eendracht macht Macht, which is kind of funny. It used to be the coat of arms of the Dutch Republic from the mid-16th century to the mid-19th. Unity makes power. Unity produces power, right? So there's a unity between the asylum seeker and the nation state because we have the same culture. That's where unity gets produced. It was also that of the Republic of South Africa. Well, Republic of South Africa, which is ironic too. So in this case, cultural unity, and that's my maybe closing point, cultural unity seems to guarantee new forms of political subjectivation. And this kind of discourse of culture is one where I would say it's on the flip side of cultural citizenship. If cultural citizenship was used by post-colonials, by queers, and by other groups, it is also a form of cultural citizenship the state now deploys as well. So cultural citizenship in itself doesn't guarantee any kind of politically progressive impulse here. Rather, it seems to me one would need to look precisely at who is articulating this question of culture. In other words, what is the form of appearance in Marxist sense of cultural value? And I'd simply close by saying that therefore the distinction between West and East, the political value of that distinction would need to be interrogated in every particular case. It doesn't seem to me de-Westernization, de-Orientalization necessarily would produce a radical political impulse. And there I would like to refer to the first talk of today, that if you think of co-implication here, then we we would have to be careful. One could talk about decolonizing maybe better than de-Westernization, because in this case that I mentioned, the state readily jumped in and reinstituted that distinction, right? By reproducing again a discourse of the West. Okay, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.